begin at the beginning. Kindly tell us who you are and what you do.
Well, my name is Kieran Prendergast. I am a former British diplomat for 33 years. Then I was an international civil servant for 9 years. So basically I'm a former. And what I do now is I have a range of activities, some recompense, some pro bono, with a focus, I suppose, on conflict resolution rather than conflict prevention.
So Kieran, could you give us your assessment of the current crisis in Iraq and Syria with regards to ISIS?
That's a very big subject with many components. I think the problem in Iraq is that the Sunnis of Iraq, who are a minority, an important minority, but a minority, believe and have always believed that they are the group who should be running Iraq. They didn't feel defeated in 2003 by the war. They felt that the Saddam regime had been defeated. What happened before the war was that senior American officers were telephoning Iraqi generals on their mobiles, believe it or not, and telling them that if they didn't fight, if their tanks were formed into a circle with the guns pointing down and inward, then they wouldn't be attacked. So essentially the war was a trot over. I don't want to belittle it, but it was a trot over for the Americans. And the deal they had thought was that they would continue to have a role in Iraq. And then they found they were double crossed by the disbandment of the army, and further by the decision by Jerry Bremer that anybody who'd been a member of the Ba'ath Party would have no future role in Iraq, and they wouldn't have pensions, or they'd have no living, they'd have no nothing. And when you combine that with the extraordinary carelessness of the coalition in leaving vast stockpiles of weapons lying around, that was a formula for difficulty, and that's why you had the first insurgency. Then you had the so-called Sunni awakening, where the Americans realised that they needed actually to co-opt the Sunnis and Sunni tribes in particular to fight Al-Qaeda. And Al-Qaeda made very serious mistakes by trying to force marriages with women from the tribes and so on, killing tribal leaders who resisted that. So it was a fertile ground for bringing the Sunnis back on board, because they hadn't been included in any meaningful sense in the political process before then. And this was something that we were very worried about at the UN. Then you had Maliki, who became the Prime Minister of Iraq, essentially with a minority government in the first place. He didn't win the elections, but he managed to become Prime Minister. And he basically welched on the deal that had been struck through the Americans, and the Sunnis again were squeezed out of power. And they do have a capacity to plan. And I think that, for example, the capture of Mosul had quite evidently been planned for a long time, and very cleverly. And people I know who are involved in this sort of business tell me that the way that ISIS operates in Iraq is a combination of very careful Soviet-style army planning, so things are not done on impulse, they're very carefully planned ahead. Otherwise Mosul couldn't have been taken by a relatively short, small force, but that's combined with the sort of dash of the inner core of ISIS, who are inspired by the early caliphs after the Prophet Muhammad. And if you remember, the Arabs swept out of the Arabian Peninsula and conquered a large part of the world, of the then known world. And so you have this combination of careful planning and also daring, and of course the sort of shock and awe tactics that were followed by the early caliphs, which involve a lot of rape, pillage, beheading, and so on. Many of it seems to me a slightly incongruous group, though it's hanging together right now, because you combine these Wahhabi, jihadist, extremist ISIS inner core with a lot of former Ba'athist army officers who will have been secular, and also in the case of Mosul, the so-called Naqshbandi army. Now, Naqshbandis are a Sufi group, and they would be oil and water normally with ISIS. I'm told that ISIS have learned the lesson of Al-Qaeda and therefore trying not to act in a way that would alienate the tribe. So we have a big problem. We also have the tearing up of the Sykes-Picot agreement. ISIS in Syria concentrating on gathering territory rather than necessarily fighting the forces of the Assad regime. There have been complaints that the Assad regime haven't been fighting ISIS either. And so you have this extraordinary situation where you have a de facto Sunni caliphate state running across big chunks of Syria and Iraq. The Peshmerga of the Kurdish regional government hadn't had a serious fight for 20 years. They didn't do well when they came into confrontation against ISIS. I think is a very necessary thing for the West to give them some assistance, particularly since they seem to have been outgunned in terms of military hardware by ISIS, who, as you know, captured vast chunks of Iraqi army equipment in Mosul. The big immediate danger in Iraq is if ISIS decides to attack or destroy major Shia shrines. If that happens, then you're going to have an all-out sectarian war in Iraq. Iran is trying to keep out of it, but it might be more difficult for them if this turned into a direct Sunni-Shia confrontation.
Thank you. A difficult question. What do you think is going to happen? Is there anything that can be done?
Well, I think first of all, the new Iraqi government has to be a great deal more inclusive than the Maliki government was. I think you have to show the Sunni Iraqi Arabs, because one mustn't forget that the Kurds are Sunni too. One must show them that they have a real place and a real stake in a future Iraq. I think you need careful assistance from the West, but ISIS are not going to be defeated by a squadron of F-16s. They will have to be defeated on the ground as well. And ISIS have shown some very considerable tactical sophistication, because they're not going to just sit out in the open to be hit by drones. They are moving into towns and lying low in towns and building a position there, rather as they did in Mosul over a considerable period of time. So it's not going to be easy. I think the security situation in Iraq is very fragile. I think the situation in parts of Kurdistan is very fragile. One of the things that I find interesting is the way in which the PKK and their Syrian sister organisation, the YPG, the People's Defence Forces in Syria, have come to the fore, because they're the ones who rescued the Yazidis from the mountain, and they're the ones who are actually battle hardened and capable of taking a good fight to ISIS. And so their international standing is changing. They've been a terrorist organisation nobody wants to talk to. Now people are going to have to talk to them.